Won't you just center your hearts and minds as we gather today for these purposes? Gracious God, the one who has created all, we thank you this day for making space and time in this very place for us to gather, seek to be of one mind and of one mission as we explore the dynamics of what it means to be part of cities and localities, oh God, that are not doing all that they can do to protect and uplift our children and the educational process. So we're giving thanks in advance for all that will happen here this day. We thank you for the leadership that has gathered us together. Oh Lord, may we become united as workers and as team members as we work together to fulfill your purposes here in this city and the surrounding areas. This is our prayer this day. May we all say amen.
Amen. Thank you. I'm not going to speak for very long. I just want to introduce myself and welcome you. I'm Peter Carmen. I'm the pastor of this church. And I'm grateful for everybody's being here. We have a very new, semi-formed organization of people that's called us together. People in the faith community in Schenectady who haven't known each other before. And it's good that this is the way we're getting to know each other. We're gathered here today to address a fundamental issue of justice, injustice, that plagues not only this city, but all of us who are residents of New York. It's a question of the common good. It's a question of fair and equitable state funding to support the children and the youth of this state in their pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which, as we know, includes the pursuit of a decent education. It is a problem that is decades in the making. This is not a new problem in New York State or in Schenectady, but our children do not have decades to wait for solutions from their elders. I'm really pleased to welcome Laurence Spring here, our superintendent of schools, to address this issue. The weather has conspired to make it possible for him to be here. He's had a death in the family and thought he was going to be away this weekend, and weather elsewhere means that he can be here, so we offer our prayers for your family as you deal with a loss, and we are glad to have you here. I also want to say we are not here simply to listen and make supportive noises. We're really good at that. We are really good at that, but we are here to organize today. And so following Superintendent Spring's remarks and an opportunity for some question and answers, we're going to ask you to do two things. The first is to help us get out a petition, which each of you should have 2 pages for. We gave you, in case you don't have quick access to a copier, but you can make your own copies of that. We'd like more than 22 signatures, thank you. We want to get out a petition and get it back. And the second thing is we would like to ask you to help us figure out how to implement the best ways to get our word out and then to do it. So that's it, and without further ado, let us welcome Superintendent Spring. Please put your hands together.
So, thank you very much for having me here today. I'm Larry Spring. I'm the superintendent of schools at Schenectady. I have spent time with most of you, but for those of you that don't know, I appreciated here in Rochester in our opening. I spent about 20 years in the Rochester area. I started my teaching just outside of Rochester in East Irondequoit, and had various administrative positions around the Rochester area before I went to Cortland to be a superintendent of schools there for 6 years before coming to Schenectady. In all of my time as a superintendent, I have always wrestled with budget issues. Never there is enough money. I've always had to wrestle with this notion of not getting enough state aid, working in places where the local community struggles to provide the resources that the community needs. And that's not an unusual issue, because what we want to do in education usually exceeds what some might say is needed. And so that's a very common tension everywhere in education. But the things that we're talking about now go back many decades before I entered school administration, before I entered the teaching profession, before I entered school. And so we can go back to 61 years ago, the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision. And most folks know Brown v. Board was a Supreme Court decision that said separate but equal is not okay, and that schools, in particular in a town in Kansas, but in fact across the country, must provide the same resources to all students, and that they could not be separated by race. New York State actually spent resources, sent people to Arkansas to help them desegregate their schools. Not too far after that, there was the passage of the Civil Rights Act that said any distribution of government funds cannot be disproportionately distributed based upon a protected class of citizenship. And it went on to list what those protected classes of citizenship are. And you're probably very familiar with them. So you cannot, if you're spending government funds, you cannot spend them differently on people based on their gender, based on their religion. You can't pay some folks of one religion more money than those of another just because that's their religion or their gender. Race is one of those protected classes. And I go back with this history lesson because 61 years after Brown versus Board of Education, when New York State actually sent money and resources to help Arkansas, to help desegregation in Little Rock, Arkansas, at this moment, New York State has the most segregated school system in the country. Our school system is more segregated than any other state system of public education in the country. Less than half of the students in New York State are white, but only 8%, only 55 of nearly 700 school districts in New York State serve predominantly minority students. So Black and Latino students are highly concentrated into a small number of schools. Now, a number of years ago, some folks in New York City were upset with the funding that they were getting for their schools. It was not enough. Some of those schools in New York City were dramatically underfunded. Some were doing much better. Right? And so that school district had their own disparities within that funding. They brought lawsuit. It was known as the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. They brought lawsuit against the state, saying that school districts that are of poorer wealth are not getting enough money to fund them. They won that lawsuit. This was against then Governor George Pataki. He appealed it. They won the appeal. He appealed that. They won the appeal. Made it all the way up to the Court of Appeals, right? the highest court in New York State. And they won there as well. They won every single time. So then the governor had to create some way to abide by this decision. And the judge forced it. The judge appointed a special master to bring people together who know more about educational funding and educational needs than court officers do. And he had those folks get together, and they created a standard of education that should be the constitutional minimum. Right? So the Constitution says that it is the state's obligation to provide this sound basic education to every child. And so this panel created a standard for that. Here's what sound basic education means. And they said, here's what it looks like it would cost to achieve that across the state. Not what it would cost to get the really fantastic education, and not what it would take just to be occupied for 8 hours a day, but to achieve a meaningful, sound, basic education. And they recognized that that cost would be different in Clinton County, New York, as compared to Westchester, New York. Cost of living is just more in Westchester. It will cost more to do these basic things in Westchester than it will in Clinton County. Took that into account. They also took into account that not all kids are the same. Kids who come from wealthy families have more advantages and are better able to succeed in education than kids who have been living in poverty. They need more services, they need additional help to catch up, to level that playing field. And they factored that in. They also factored in the notion that the frequency of poverty in an area impacts the effectiveness of education. And so one child living in poverty amidst a largely middle-class cohort of students is better off than a milieu of poverty where every child is living in poverty. The effect of that poverty compounds itself and makes it very, very difficult for kids to catch up. And they factored that in and said those kids need additional resources, they need additional help. And they came up with this cost for every single school district across the state. Here's what it should cost to provide a sound basic education for students in Schenectady. Here's what it should cost to provide a sound basic education for students in Niskayuna, in Rye, New York, in New York City, in Buffalo, in Jamestown, in every single school district in the state, nearly 700 school districts. Then they analyzed each local economy. How much property wealth is there in that district? How much income wealth is there in that district? Basically what they wanted to know is how much can the local taxpayers afford of that cost to provide that education? We don't want to put an undue burden on those folks. It's not fair to ask everyone to pay the same because some folks are much more able to pay than others, and it's the state's constitutional obligation to provide that minimum. And so they identified that, come up with what's known as the combined wealth ratio. This is a way in which you decide that a combination of property wealth and income wealth tells you how wealthy a particular locality is. And it's a ratio, so 1.0 is average. The average school district in New York State will always have a combined wealth ratio of 1.0 because of the nature of it being a ratio. Schenectady's combined wealth ratio is 0.35. We are about a third as wealthy as the average school district in New York State. That all by itself does not seem terribly surprising, but to give you a bit of a context around this, we look at some of the school districts near us, some of the places that we think are really, really wealthy. Look at them, we wish we had that. Their combined wealth ratios are in the neighborhood of 1.0. These are not really wealthy districts. We do not have really wealthy districts around us. These are districts of average wealth. So Niskayuna has a combined wealth ratio of about 1.0. Bethlehem has a combined wealth ratio of 1.0. These are average wealth districts. They only appear wealthy to us because of our combined wealth ratio. The wealthiest district in New York State has a combined wealth ratio of 49. 49. It's 49 times as wealthy as the average district in New York State. So a school district near us that has a combined wealth ratio of 1.3 is not wealthy. It's average. Even if it has a combined wealth ratio of 1.5, it's average. 49 is wealthy. Ridiculously wealthy. And so the state comes up with this formula known as the foundation formula. This formula for age should form the foundation of how school districts fund themselves and provide educational services to kids and tax their public. This foundation formula says, here's how much it should cost you to provide this sound basic education to children. Here's how much you should be able to afford. We're going to subtract that. And what's left as the difference is the state's obligation in state aid. It seems relatively simple. The formula was created and it was adopted in law about 10 years ago. In order to have it adopted, in order to get the legislature to say, yes, we agree to this law, there were politics involved. One of those things that they did is they said, we're not going to balance this on the backs of those folks who are already getting more than what that formula says they should get. We're not going to take any money away from anybody. We're going to hold them harmless. It's a hold harmless clause in that law. So nobody will get less in order to bring people up. We will level everyone up, but we're not going to take money away from others to get them up. And Pataki basically ignored the foundation formula. He ignored the law, he ignored the ruling. It wasn't until Spitzer came into office that he essentially made a political decision. People were battling over money, and essentially for him it was education or healthcare, and he sided with education. We're going to set aside the interests of these labor groups in healthcare, and instead we are going to start funding this foundation formula, and he laid out a plan for, at first it was 3 years that we were going to reach full funding for foundation aid. He ran into a couple of difficulties, and his successor, David Patterson, came into office, and he said, I don't think we can quite do that in 3 years. We'll stretch it out to 4. And then a financial crisis hit, and it stretched out even more. And eventually they said, not only are we not going to be able to continue to add money to this to try to get closer to fully funding that foundation formula, we're actually going to have to take some money away from you and give you less than what we gave you last year. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that the law says they can't do that. So they had a neat little trick. They, on paper, said we gave you that money, but then we're going to put an excise tax on you, the gap elimination adjustment, and take it back from you. Because the law doesn't say we can't take it back. The law just says we can't give you less, and so we'll take back some from you. And so there are a number of districts, Schenectady included, that are actually getting less aid now than they were a number of years ago, despite that hold harmless clause. When we think about where that is now and what that means, right? The financial crisis was tough. I don't think anybody would say that that was not difficult. Mr. Spring, please be reasonable. It was really a financial crisis. We can't be throwing millions of dollars at school districts when, really there is this very real financial crisis. People are losing jobs. There are homes that are being foreclosed upon. There are all of these things that are very real that are happening. And I agree completely. My argument with the state has not been whether or not there was a real financial crisis, whether or not they had the money to fully fund the foundation formula. Schenectady is one of the poorest school districts in the state. Our combined wealth ratio at 0.35 is near the bottom of the state. There are some school districts that have a lower combined wealth ratio than us, not many. We get about 55% of what the foundation formula says we're supposed to get. That means that we're shorted about $62 million every year. $62 million each year. Not over the last 10 years since the establishment of the foundation formula. We get pretty excited in our district when the state aid runs come out and they increase our aid by about $4 or $5 million. This past year we were able to, for the first time since I've been a superintendent, increase the level of service that we're able to provide students, hire more staff, without having to lay anyone off or raise taxes. We left our levy flat, we didn't lay off a single person, and we increased our service to kids by about $5 million. I was pretty excited by that. And it was flat out. To make $5 million worth of additional growth and change in the district was really difficult. We still have a couple of positions that we haven't filled. It's hard to make that much change happen that quickly. That's a scale of change at $5 million. We're shorted over $60 million every single year. That's a renewing shortfall. But Mr. Spring, there is this financial crisis. please be aware and please be patient. Everyone is hurting. I wasn't quite sure that I bought that argument. And I did a little analysis. There were some other folks out there who were making noise about not everyone is hurting. The poorer districts are getting less of their foundation aid than the wealthier districts. This is not fair. And I kept looking at that analysis and watching that argument happen. And I don't think I mentioned, I think I forgot to tell you, when I was in the Rochester area, when I started teaching, I was a social studies teacher. And I taught U.S. history most of the time. And so I dabbled in Constitution. Dabbled in some of these events that I talked about, the Civil Rights Act, and it struck me. The problem with that argument, the problem that what people were arguing, that these poor districts are getting less of their financial aid than wealthy districts, is that being poor is not a protected class of citizenship. It's not illegal to discriminate against the poor. It was a difficult revelation for me. It can be wrong. We can agree as adults that that's a very wrong thing to do. It's abominable. But when you go through the Civil Rights Act and you look at the protected classes of citizen, wealth is not one of them. Poverty is not one of them. But I also know that when we talk about wealth and when we talk about poverty, we cannot ignore race. Because of the way in which our policies have been structured, the way in which our society has evolved, they are fairly tightly tied together. So I took the demographic statistics from the state education department and I integrated them with the state aid information from the budget department, and I ran a regression. And what I found infuriated me. Because what the governor had been saying, what the legislature had been saying, is that, Mr. Spring, you need to be patient. We can't afford to fund everybody with this foundation formula. It's too rich a formula, and we don't have nearly enough money. But what I found is that we don't have enough money to fund the districts that have Black and Latino kids in them. The higher the percentage of students in a district that are white, the higher percentage of their foundation funding they got. That district that I talked about that gets 40, that has a combined wealth ratio of 49, it's 49 times as wealthy as the average district in New York State, gets nearly 2,000% of the aid that the law says it's supposed to get.
2,000?
Somebody got it. The school district that is 49 times as wealthy as the average district gets more than 2,000, gets almost 2,000% of the aid that the law says they're supposed to get. The school district that is a third as wealthy as the average district gets just over half the aid that the law says it's supposed to get. And when you plot it, there are certainly exceptions, but overwhelmingly, the predictive factor for how much they're going to get is the percent of white students in that district. There are only 55 districts in the state that serve predominantly minority students. That's 8% of all the districts in the state. Those districts are 10 times as likely to receive less than 70% of their funding than school districts that serve predominantly white students. I was very upset by this. I brought this to my Board of Education. We talked about it for a while, talked about what we might do with it. Certainly any time that you begin to talk about race and these kinds of things, it makes some people uncomfortable. Right? We're often unsure how to have that conversation. We're unsure how to deal with some of the discomfort, some of the anger, some of the history that those conversations bring up. We decided this was too significant to not talk about. We needed to talk about it more publicly, and we needed to be more assertive with it. And I brought the information to the governor's office. I had 2 meetings with the governor's staff. First, with his education folks. They had never heard of this. They were shocked, aghast. He said, we need to have another meeting. Can you come back? Absolutely. Second meeting, budget analysts, and lawyers. I'm not a lawyer. I don't even pretend to be one. They asked me some very interesting questions that told me they were not all that interested in fixing this problem, but mitigating their liability. And I made sure that they understood. I have no desire to make this a public thing. I have no desire to put my name on anything. I'm bringing this information because I think the governor is looking for ways to score wins in the public eye. Here's a place where I think he could say, look what I found. I'm going to right a wrong. Look what I can do to make things better in New York State. The folks from the education side of his office said, I can't do anything for you in this budget cycle. We're a little too late for that, but you need to know that you've been heard. Okay. He got fired about 2 months later. The governor clearly has done nothing about that. What we ended up doing was filing a civil rights complaint with the federal government. The Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education eventually accepted our complaint. This is after a little bit of, they're saying, we don't think we have jurisdiction. We think the Department of Justice has it. Okay, I can see that. Makes some sense to me. We filed with the Department of Justice. They said, we don't think we have jurisdiction. We think it belongs at civil rights. We said, did you read our brief? Because we included in there their letter that said they think it's over here. And it took the efforts of one of our good senators to kind of grab those two offices by the scruff of the neck and say, you guys are idiots. Don't do that to people. One of you needs to own it. And the Office of Civil Rights eventually owned it. They took a look at it, which is all that we asked that they do. Examine it. Once they examined it, I felt that our case was compelling. The next step was to decide whether or not they would open up an investigation. And they did. The first time ever in the history of that office, they opened up an investigation based on a complaint by one state agency against a state. It's the first time that they have ever engaged in this type of investigation. The data is compelling. They stripped away a few pieces of the complaint. In addition to race, we also complained regarding our special population, students with special needs, and students who are English language learners. And they pared away both of those parts of the complaint, said that our data is not compelling enough, but that our data around race is more than compelling enough. I've been down to meet with them a couple of times since then. Once with program folks so they could query me on the development of the budget, the foundation formula, and those kinds of things. And then a second time with their attorneys so that they could grill me like I'm an attorney. I asked, usually I'm on the other side of this. A parent sometimes complains against the school district. We're disciplining kids unfair. Our suspension rates are disproportionate. More black kids get suspended than white kids, and we get a complaint. And they ask us lots of very tough questions. I said, when that parent complains, do you ask the parent those same questions? I said, well, no, we don't. I said, well, why are you asking me those questions then? I don't understand. I'm the complainant. And they went on to explain to me that this not only is the first time that they've opened up an investigation, this is the first time that they've done such a thing. And they're creating new law as they go. And so they want to be very, very careful what they do. So there will be a finding, they told me. There certainly will be a finding. But the disproportionate clause of the Civil Rights Act that they're using is a very sharp tool. And there are many other districts around the state and around the country that are watching to see what happens with this. And so they want to be very careful and very mindful what they do, because it could have consequences that could be far greater than they are prepared to take responsibility for. Cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Houston, watching this case to see what happens, how they decide, make a determination as to whether or not they will file a similar complaint against their state. That that last conversation that I had with the Civil Rights Department was in May. So it's been a number of months since then. It's been well over a year since they opened the investigation. And as we go through another budget cycle, as we see the governor's proposal, as we listen to the rhetoric of the legislators, you know, what the Senate is advocating for. So if you follow these things at all, you know that the governor has proposed a fairly meager increase in state aid, still not up to levels where school districts were a number of years ago. And he's putting almost nothing into the foundation formula. Essentially, what he's ensuring is that those who have get theirs first. And those who have not should wait and be okay with it. And we listen to what the Senate says. And John Flanagan, who's the majority leader of the Senate, he says, we will not have a budget unless we eliminate the gap elimination adjustment. This is the money that New York State took away from school districts. Now that seems like a pretty reasonable thing to ask. Eliminate the gap elimination adjustment, right? They're taking money away from us. However, that money is disproportionately affecting the wealthy districts. And so if they eliminate the gap elimination adjustment, that will benefit Schenectady City Schools to the tune of $23,000. We're shorted $62 million. The Senate is advocating $23,000. Not okay. Now, I don't agree with very much that John Flanagan says or believes. I've had a number of conversations with him, but I do find him to be a very forthright and direct individual, and I always appreciate that. I like to think of myself also as very forthright and direct. And so when I have asked him directly about the disproportionality of foundation aid, why is it that the demographic makeup of a school district is so powerfully predictive in its state aid, his direct answer to me was, we know that that's that way, there is just not the will to address it. And so we won't. Next question. I appreciate that answer. I don't like it. I don't think that's an appropriate way to be a leader. I think when you become a leader, you have the obligation, not just, especially when you are an elected official, you have the obligation not just to attend to what your particular constituency wants, but you also take an oath to uphold the Constitution of New York and the Constitution of the United States. And I think that that approach violates both of those constitutions. The Assembly is a little more friendly to this. We have our own two assemblymen, Assemblyman Steck and Santa Barbara, who have pushed this agenda. The Assembly leader, Carl Hastie, pushes this agenda, but they need help, they need assistance. You know, that you've heard the story about 3 men in a room designing the budget. Carl Hastie is the lone person who's seeking to find equity for these school districts, and so he needs assistance. We press on our senators. We have 2 Republican senators that represent the school district locally. That's a little bit unusual, but I think it's to our advantage. Senator Amador has a small slice of Schenectady, and Senator Farley has a fairly significant slice. Senator Farley is, I believe at this moment, the most senior sitting Republican senator. He should have some influence in that caucus. Senator Amador is in a vulnerable seat in the Senate at a time when the majority of the Senate is in a vulnerable place. He should have some influence over this. I've had a conversation with Senator Amador. He believes, not just for Schenectady, but also for some districts that he does not represent. He believes that Albany, Schenectady, and Troy all need to be treated much more fairly in the foundation formula. He doesn't have a particular interest in schools or social justice, I don't think. Here's the piece that I think has him very intrigued, and I think it should have the rest of our public very intrigued. $62 million Schenectady is shorted. I could not spend, nor would I spend, $62 million in additional service on our children. I think that we're missing about $38 million of service to our kids. That means about $24 million of that 62 should be going back to lowering the tax rate. That means that what the school district taxes would be cut in half, and the typical taxpayer, someone who's paying property taxes, their tax bill, all property taxes included, would be cut by about a third. I want you to stop and think about that for a second. Think about when you get a tax bill in the mail and you open it up and you take a look at that figure, and I want you to cut it by a third. That's nice. That feels good. What would you do with that money? Right? You could save it, you invest it. Maybe you could buy a car. But when we think about what that means in a larger scale, not just for individuals, we think about what that means to groups like the Chamber of Commerce. We think about what that means to BDCs and IDAs, business development councils. They work, Metroplex works to create pilot agreements to reduce taxes to lure businesses in. Because they want to put businesses in Schenectady, because that aids the development, it creates a stronger tax base, it creates more traffic in Schenectady, and it aids the economic development. Cutting all property taxes by a third would be the best economic development program anybody could design. And it wouldn't be temporary, it wouldn't be a special program, it wouldn't have an expiration date. It would happen just because we funded schools to the tune that the law says they're supposed to be funded in. For individual folks, when your taxes go down, your home value goes up. When home value goes up, it creates a significant stepping stone to help us create more neighborhood stability. We have an interest in the school district, as does the community, in reducing the number of foreclosures and reducing the number of evictions, reducing the environmental instability that our kids are living with. And that economic cycle is extremely important to helping to make that happen. So there are certainly things that we need to do in the school district with that $38 million. We need to provide significant and intensive mental health supports for our youngest children in our schools. We have intensive academic interventions that our middle-aged kids need. They're behind in reading. They need extra assistance to catch up. Our oldest kids get disengaged from school. They get jaded by the system. They need to be re-engaged. They need to know that there are adults that care about them. They need to be hooked up with mentors and internships, and they need reasons to sustain and persist in school and pursue a diploma. We need to do all of those things. We need to do them better, and we need more of those things to do with our children. But it's this other $24 million that has an impact far beyond anyone who has children in the schools. This other $24 million changes the dynamic of how the city and its economic system move from that moment forward. That's the part that everyone should care about, beyond the basic caring that we should have about what education does for children, what it does for our legacy, and what it does for society and a democratic society as we go forward. These numbers and the callousness with which our politicians treat it should be an affront to our conscience. We should be insulted that they don't take it more seriously. We should be insulted that they don't see that this is a very important thing that they should be addressing. And we should be angry and outraged that they're not taking stronger action about it. I'm heartened that you've come together. I am excited that you've given up some of your time on a Saturday and that you're willing to put forth some effort and action in order to try to make something happen, to help our elected leaders know that this is not okay and that we need to do something different. We can work together. We can support each other. I believe that we can make this change happen. I know that there are people who are hearing our voices. I know that there are people who are holding their breath, hoping that things don't change. I know that many of my colleagues, other superintendents, are not particularly happy with me, because they know if we get $62 million, that's coming from somewhere. And so I'm often not very popular in those circles because I want to take their money. And I'm okay with that, because our kids need that money more. I can go on for a long time.
Why don't we go to some questions?
But I want to give you an opportunity to ask some questions.
So we have a microphone? Questions?
You mentioned that a major portion of the 62 million is going to be would be something that would be used to decrease the tax base for homeowners in the communities. How would this subsequently help those who are not necessarily homeowners, but children are very much in the school district and could still benefit from this as well?
Mm-hmm. So the majority of those funds would be going directly into those services for the school district, so $38 million. And the broad three areas that we talk about, and there are a lot more than this, but we have a high prevalence of mental illness with kids in the district. We know that these things come with poverty and neighborhood disorganization, so kids who have anxiety, kids who have depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, comes with things like living in with food insecurity and these kinds of things. So providing much more direct support to help kids deal with and cope and develop coping strategies for those things. When we talk about the intermediate level, we're talking about much increased direct intensive academic support. How do we help kids catch up? How do we deliver more intensive reading instruction, smaller groups, smaller class sizes, more supports in the schools to help kids catch up to where they need to be. And as kids get a little bit older, we know that we've already got kids who are disengaged. We've significantly cut our dropout rate in the last 4 years in the school district, but we know that we still have significant numbers of kids that are waiting for them to be old enough to drop out of school. And even those kids that aren't necessarily dropping out, they're not necessarily working as hard as they could or should be at being successful in school. We know that motivation towards that is often relationship-based. That's resource-intensive. We need to get kids hooked up with mentors. We need them to see reasons for school. That means getting them into real-world places where they can see how their skills would apply and adapt. So getting them internships, getting them connected with people who use these skills, who value these skills, people that they know and recognize and respect and can do those things. That's on these broad categories. We think about a little bit more detailed and a little bit more specific to some of these things. One of the things that we would like to grow, we're starting to try to grow it at Lincoln Elementary, is this notion of the community school. And that's broadening the scope of the role that a school plays within a neighborhood. And so I like to think of a community school as being a single point of access. And so how do we bring in community partners and agencies into the school so that parents can get access to any agency partner that they might need to interact with right there at the school? How do we help the school keep its doors open much longer in the evening so that we have not just school academic things happening there, but the school can be a community base. In this way, the school can actually play a role in creating neighborhood stability, helping parents get jobs. I want the school district to play a role in helping parents to stay in their homes. We know that We've got a significant problem with transiency in the district. We've got about 670 kids to 700 kids in each cohort as they go through the district, kindergarten through 12th grade, 13 years. 670 kids move all the way along like that. It stays about 670 kids as they move along. But by the time they get to 12th grade, there have been nearly 2,000 kids through that cohort. Individual kids moving out, moving in. Only about 103 of those kids stay with us all the way through. Those 103 kids, they've got a graduation rate of 96%. How do we help our other kids, those families, stay put? How do we help them? Because I think we can help them avoid the pressures that push them out of their homes. And those are things that a community school model, I think, can help with.
You had a question?
You mentioned that New York State is a segregated school district, but if you take it locally to the city of Schenectady, the city's about 40% people of color, black and brown. School district is more than that with black and brown students. Do you have a plan in place to reflect the community that you are serving with people of color, meaning administration on levels in administration, teacher, staffing, as well as within the students? Being segregated, you have about 60% or more students of color, but administration doesn't reflect the community that it's serving. So is there a plan in place to address that within teachers, administration, as well as within the school district as a whole, even on the school board?
So there are activities that we have planned and aims that we have. I don't know that we've said that the goal is that those numbers should match exactly. So what we've done is changed where it is that we go to recruit teachers. We've changed the way in which we hire staff. So hiring teachers used to be kind of an all call to principals. Who are the subs that have been doing a good job? Give us those names. And that's who we'll interview from. I think what a lot of the research that I've read has said is that a lot of racism and bias is implicit. It's not overt. People tend to have affinity for those who are like them. And so it really wouldn't surprise anybody to find the names that came forward through that system looked an awful lot like the people who were putting those names forward. And I'm sure they were good people. I'm sure it didn't have anything to do with that. So we went to an online application system, and every position gets posted. And so now we're drawing candidates from a much broader area. We changed where it is that we recruit teachers, stopped going to places like the Cortland Teacher Recruitment Fair, and started going to NYU and bringing our materials to those folks, and asking folks who made a choice to go to college to be a teacher in a place that was much more diverse, and to sell ourselves to those places. We put in place a system in our interviews because one of the things that we found, and this is not, there's tough stuff around this. One of the things that we found is probably implicitly, but candidates get treated differently in interviews. And so, especially when we're talking about some of these higher level positions, we've got somebody on those interview committees who's designated as a watcher, watching the behaviors of the committee to make sure that nobody is engaging in implicit bias, that every candidate, regardless of color, is getting fair and equal treatment in that process. So it's a concern for us. We know that kids of color do a little better when they have a teacher who is like them. We also know that they are more likely to be identified as gifted and talented if they're taught by someone like them. So these are things that we look for. These are things that we want to grow. But we also know on the flip side of that, the teacher candidate pool and the administrative candidate pool is overwhelmingly white. And not surprisingly, reflecting the faculty of those institutions that prepare teachers, almost entirely white. And so it's a difficult battle to try to wade into and just make happen. But there are certainly explicit and overt steps that we take as an institution to try to encourage more candidates of color and to ensure that when they step into the system, that we're not inadvertently weeding anyone out that we
But
shouldn't.
is there currently a plan in place or a plan to come up with a plan to be in place to address the issues
So I
of the
guess
school board and administration?
I guess it depends on what you mean by plan. I've got a sequence of steps and activities that we engage in. So tell me your definition of plan.
Coming up, structuring it. If someone comes,
So I just described for you a set of structured steps that we do every time. Is that a plan? We have a plan, Ange.
Yes, this is a two-part question. The first part is, how does the lottery fit into this, since they were supposed to be collecting these lottery dollars for monies for education, and they hold everybody up on the line buying them. So what does that have to do with it? And the other part is that we keep addressing a lot of these issues as civil rights issues. And many of our leaders have said we have to stop using this as a civil rights leaders situation, because a lot of times the people who are in charge of those areas are not, they don't have our best interest at heart. And we need to turn this into a human rights issue and take it to the United Nations for what they're doing to a complete group of people here in this country.
The first part of your question again?
The lottery.
The lottery. Okay. So what happens? The state does collect these lottery monies. They go into this big pool of funding, and it ends up being a little bit of a shell game. It's difficult for us to track. Is that money really additional money, or is it just displacing other money that would have been there? And I think that's very difficult to tell. I think that they are putting the lottery money in to the education funding stream, but I think it really is probably just displacing other money that would have been there. I think the human rights aspect and with the United Nations is an interesting one, but I think also very similar to why I chose the Office of Civil Rights in a federal complaint is the United Nations holds no legal or regulatory authority over the United States. And in fact, every single time that there's been any kind of motion that would in some way subject the United States to the authority of the United Nations in the way that it does with other nations, we've flatly objected to that and have refused to put ourselves in that situation. So I do believe it is a human rights issue. I believe similarly it's wrong to discriminate against school districts based on wealth or anyone based on poverty. But I think there's also a pragmatic piece of where is there a legal foothold? Where is there a lever that we can actually pull?
Would you all join me with putting your hands together and saying thank you? Really, there's lots more conversation to be had with you directly, and I give you're here, give people a chance to keep that going for a few minutes as we transition. We are going to have 4 breakout groups. The folks who are going to work on distributing the petition, how many of you are interested in working on distribution and return of petition? Okay, we've got 4 or 5. So we will we'll keep you right here, okay? The people who are interested in working on, and Bernardo, are you working with that group? Would you stand up?
Pastor Roberts.
And Pastor Roberts is working with this group. So you're staying here. The next steps, as in how do we talk to our legislators and governor, will be going to the boardroom, which is where the coffee pot is. I know it's not fair, but that's going there. Other people can sneak in and get some coffee or drinks on your way in as we go there. and I will be going, actually you're going there with Sarah, I think, is that right? Oh, no, you're doing partners, okay. So the partners group, the media group is going to go into the gathering room, which is over there. Who's working with the media group? Okay, and Al, I'm going to get you, how many people are interested in working on media? You're willing to work on media? Okay, we got about 5 or 6 on media. That's the room that's directly behind you back there. We need a couple more chairs. And there's the parlor is where we're going to put the partners group. So who's on the partners group? Phil and Sarah's on that. So Phil and Sarah, the parlor is the last room if you're headed to the door. On your left, it's where we have Bible study. So with Sarah, see where Sarah and Phil are. Who's interested in working on finding these partners? Like, I know we've got a union person here.
Oh yeah. Peter, why don't you, Mike? Peter, why don't you say a little bit more about what you're doing?
Okay, good thought.
I'm sorry. Hello.
I enjoy calling you out.
Yeah.
So I'll do it quick.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yes. So what we've done is we've thought about, okay, how are we going to do this? We broke it out in 4 pieces. Okay? We don't have the answers on all those things. You're the leaders. So the first thing we're going to do is get a petition out and back in 3 weeks. The second piece is we got to figure out who to give it to and how to give it to them to have some kind of impact. I mean, you can be the greatest petition in the world with 50,000 signatures and it can sit on a shelf. So we're not interested in having anything sit on any shelves. We may want to take a walk to Albany. You know, however we want. You may want to fast. I don't know. The next piece is we need to figure out how to relate to and present to the media on this. That we just can't ignore that. And the last piece is most of the folks here are here from church or other religious groups today, and the few of you who got word about it. We're glad that you got word about it. And we need to figure out how to relate to our other partners and pull them into this discussion and taking part. So those are the 4 pieces.